Let's go to our guest now in Canberra. We have journalist Dennis Shanahan. He's the political editor at the Australian newspaper and has covered every election since 1989. And Deputy Director of the Australia Institute, Ebony Bennett, also joins us. She's a former National Campaign Director for the Greens Party. I thank you both for joining us. Dennis, let me start with you. You have had so many prime ministers over the past few years. It's almost often been hard to keep up, but fascinating election ahead. Opinion polls suggest, and I'm particularly looking at this Guardian poll in front of me, that the opposition Labor is expected to win. Is that what you expect?
Yes, for 3 years now, the opposition Labor Party has been in front on two-party preferred terms and was easily expected to win, particularly after Malcolm Turnbull was removed as Prime Minister. But in the last few days, the last couple of weeks, the polls have tightened considerably, particularly in key seats, in key electorates, and there is now a possibility an outside possibility that the coalition government could be returned or, more likely, have to form a minority government. So the polls have tightened considerably during the election campaign.
Ebony Bennett, why do you think the polls have tightened considerably during the campaign? What has the coalition and Scott Morrison, what have they been saying right that has allowed that trend to happen over the past few weeks?
Well, Labor had a bit of a rocky start to the campaign, I think, and the coalition and Scott Morrison in particular has just been doggedly, going on a platform of massive tax cuts and talking about the economy, which is pretty safe ground for the coalition government. But I do think polls tend to tighten during election campaigns, and we are seeing a big differentiation between what Labor is offering the electorate and what the coalition is offering the electorate. And though the polls have tightened, I think Dennis is right that we could end up with a coalition government again. The smart money's still with the Labor government being elected on Saturday, but we could even find ourselves in a situation where the Labor Party wins the popular vote but loses a few of the marginals that it would need to form a majority government. So
Right.
smart money's still with Labor, but yeah, it's possible.
Right. And Dennis, when we look at the issues, so as far as I understand, what I've come across, climate, healthcare, property prices, education, cost of living. What is the central issue, if there is one, to voters?
Look, I think that while the climate change issue has been a major factor in elections over the last decade now and has taken a great toll on both the major parties as they divide and can't make up their mind, I think the key election issue in 2019 has been the economy, the cost of living, and wages. Labor has campaigned extremely strongly and extremely successfully on the fact that wages growth is very slow in Australia, the economy is sluggish, and as a result, they are arguing that they will put up wages by restoring various industrial relations rights and ensuring there is a minimum living wage. That has been on the other side. Scott Morrison has argued very strongly for good economic management, job creation, and he has just doggedly stuck to this message and has also argued that Labor's, which is a very radical taxation plan from opposition, in fact, the most radical plan from opposition in more than a decade, in a couple of decades, in fact, that this will hurt the economy at a time when there are global problems, China-US trade difficulties, and so the economy remains the central vote-changing issue, and that's the way Morrison has managed it.
Ebony Bennett, are we seeing two fundamentally different economic visions for the future of Australia?
Yeah, we absolutely are. The coalition government, as Dennis said, is really only taking to this election its plan for massive income tax cuts. It's about a $300 income tax, $300 billion tax income tax cuts plan that overwhelmingly will benefit the wealthiest Australians. And the Labor Party's gone very hard on closing tax concessions and tax loopholes that also overwhelmingly benefit the wealthiest Australians. But it's talking about reinvesting that money at a time when the economy is sluggish in healthcare, education, services, and infrastructure, and making a gamble that people will want to see that money redistributed, that they'll want to see that going through the economy as services rather than tax cuts to the top end of town.
And Dennis, just days before your election, your beloved former Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, has died, aged 89. Even if the political parties don't want to politicize it, will his death have an impact on the election?
Undoubtedly, there'll be an impact. Bob Hawke was arguably Labor's most successful Prime Minister. He was one of the most popular Prime Ministers. He was also a strong economic reformer. So Bob Hawke was highly regarded across all sides. Even in the last few days, he's been involved by writing articles or having articles written under his name, arguing for a vote for Labor. I think it will be impossible. No one will want to politicise it. No one has sought to do so. But the emotion that will be unleashed by Bob Hawke's death can't help but affect the campaign, as Bill Shorten today was only just having a rally where Gough Whitlam had launched his successful election campaign. So it is going to be that former Labor leaders will have quite an impact in the final hours of the campaign.
Ebony Bennett, do you agree that this will strengthen Bill Shorten and Labor?
I think Bob Hawke is so beloved as a Prime Minister that it probably can't help but boost Labor's chances. He is known as an economic reformer, but I think given this is the climate change election, we should also remember his legacy as a defender of the environment. Without Bob Hawke, Antarctica would be a quarry today. He was the person that led the campaign to prevent mining there and keep it the pristine wilderness that it is today. He also was instrumental in saving the Franklin River from being dammed. That was a massive, high-profile environmental campaign across Australia. And lastly, he stopped uranium mining in Arnhem Land. So he has an enormous legacy. Apart from his economic reforms, he also introduced Medicare, our universal healthcare system, and he's beloved in a way that the merry-go-round of recent prime ministers could only dream about today.
Dennis, you mentioned coalitions and the possibility of coalitions. Let's look at some of the smaller parties, because they will undoubtedly play a part if it comes to that. So the likes of the Richard Di Natales and the Clive Palmers and even, I guess, One Nation and so on, how important are they going to be?
Well, they're going to be important because of our compulsory voting system and our preferential voting system, so that in the lower house, in the House of Representatives, there'll be quite an impact from the Greens, led by Richard Di Natale, as well as Clive Palmer's rogue United Australia Party and the tarnished One Nation Party. They will all have an impact on which members of the major parties get elected in the lower house. It is most likely that there will only be a Green or possibly two in the lower house. There will be no One Nation or Clive Palmer representative in the lower house, but it's a different matter entirely in the Senate. In the upper house, Clive Palmer could be there. He spent $50 million to buy himself a seat in the Senate, effectively through advertising. One Nation already has senators. So in the Senate, whichever government gets in, and if Labor gets in, it won't be easy for them to implement their vast plan. As Ebony said, their redistribution plan really requires a lot of support in the Senate, and Clive Palmer's United Australia Party, Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party, some of the other minor parties that are already there in the Senate could make it very difficult for Labor to implement.
Right. So, Ebony, if you have Labor in government and they want to implement what can be called radical economic change. And then you've got somebody in there like Clive Palmer who rants about communists and says he wants to make Australia great. Not again, just great. And the likes of One Nation. I mean, you're gonna have a traffic jam, right? It's going to be very difficult to do anything.
The Senate is absolutely where government policy lives and dies. And at the moment and for the foreseeable future, it is dominated by the crossbench. So if Labor does get elected together with the Greens, it will not have a majority in the Senate, but it can probably scrape through with one other minor party, Centre Alliance. In a best case scenario, it might need a few more than that in a worst case scenario. But it's absolutely the case. It'll find a lot of common ground with the Greens on Labor's very strong climate agenda, its increased renewable energy target, its greater ambition for emissions reductions. Whereas on its economic reforms, it might run into some more difficulties with some of the other members of the crossbench. The Greens are fairly supportive of a lot of those tax reforms and tax concession, closing those loopholes, but the likes of Centre Alliance, the leftover One Nation party members, and anyone, if anyone indeed gets elected from the United Australia Party, I think they'll have much less luck there.
And Dennis, as we look at the Liberal National Coalition's legacy in leading, whether they stay in government or they end up leaving, there was a Guardian editorial, and I'm sure you've read it, and for the sake of our viewers, I'll just quote some of it. They say, "We believe the coalition's indefensible attitude to climate change, its wafer-thin policy offering, and the fact that it has not resolved the internal divisions that blighted its term in office mean it has forfeited the right to voters' trust. However you choose to exercise your democratic decision-making on Saturday, please consider your candidate's position on climate and the rapidly shrinking time frame for action. We have endured mindless scare campaigns and half-baked policy for too many decades. We don't have 3 more years to waste." So it's all about the climate for the Guardian, and they are scathingly critical of the coalition. Is it fair, Dennis?
It's entirely fair. I think that the coalition has failed because of the extremities of its party and their positions. They've been unable to come to an acceptable climate change policy which can protect the economy. Of course, while the climate change issue is important, the Australian Financial Review, the national financial paper, has already editorialised the other way, saying that no matter how reluctantly they feel they can do it and how really little the coalition deserves this because of all their internal and leadership divisions, they feel that economically they should be supported. So it depends whether you're looking at it through a climate change spectrum or an economic spectrum as to which side you think should win. But there is no doubt at all the coalition needs at some stage to come up with a climate change policy it is comfortable with itself and which will attract enough support from the public.
Ebony, as the voters go to the polls on Saturday, do they care less about climate change than the Guardian op-ed editors do?
We've certainly seen climate change rocket up the list of priorities for voters. And just today we had the Australia Institute release an open letter with 62 climate scientists, experts and prominent Australians, including 2 Nobel Prize recipients, calling on whomever forms government and indeed the next parliament to make climate change action an urgent and top priority for the next term of government. We've had emissions rising in Australia for the past few years. The coalition has absolutely failed to reduce Australia's emissions and has no clear plan to meet Australia's Paris target. And we've had a horror summer of disasters, of heat waves, bushfires and floods that really brought home the impacts of climate change that are happening now. And so I think that's why we've seen voters much more concerned about climate change this election. And I guess we'll see how important they think it is come Saturday.
Yeah, very finally, Dennis, if we have Labor winning, is that a change of foreign policy, change on migration policy?
Not really. Foreign policy tends to be bipartisan, has been over the decades. There'll be some change in emphasis. Bill Shorten says will have an Australian foreign policy with an Australian accent, perhaps a bit closer to China, but Australia has historically had to try and balance its strong relationships both with the United States and China. I don't think any great change in policy, a certain emphasis on Asia, which isn't there necessarily with the coalition, but overall, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party tend to have fairly similar foreign policies with changes on foreign aid and development aid and so forth. But I think no great about turns on foreign policy.
Minor nuances, Ebony, on foreign policy?
Yeah, I think Dennis is right. It tends to be a bipartisan issue in Australia, and I can't see that changing. I think he's right about maybe a greater focus on Asia and potentially a lot more potential for fostering better relationships with the Pacific, particularly on climate change. Our Pacific Island neighbours, I think, are really very concerned about Australia's fossil fuel exports, for example. And, we're still seeing things like proposals to subsidise new coal-fired power stations, for example. And the Pacific, that's absolutely anathema. So I think if Labor is elected, certainly at least on climate change, there's a lot greater potential there for fostering closer relationships with our closest neighbours in the Pacific.
Ebony Bennett and Dennis Shanahan, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.